Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Brennan, a man whose influence within the WSB, World Security Bureau, is well established and widely feared, was never one to hesitate when making decisions. His command was swift and decisive when it came to assigning Josslyn and Vaughn an important mission in Dalmatia. In his mind, the task was simple enough: reconnaissance, a task Josslyn could handle with ease. Brennan had no reason to doubt the mission's success, confident that his two operatives would return unharmed. At least, that was what he believed. Little did he know, the assignment would spiral into an unexpected nightmare, one that no one could have foreseen. The quiet, scenic locale of 5 Poppies was far from the safe retreat it appeared to be, and the tranquil mission would soon unravel into something far darker. Carly, Brennan's lover and confidant, was unaware that the fragile bond between her and Brennan would soon become a glaring weakness in his operation. Their relationship, built on mutual trust, had been tested before, but nothing could have prepared Carly for what was coming. As tensions within the WSB escalated, so too did the stakes of Brennan's involvement with Josslyn. It seemed that, no matter how close Carly had been to Brennan, their love would eventually be overshadowed by the raw ambition and dangerous choices that defined his role within the WSB. His affection for Carly would be his blind spot, one that would lead him to make a decision that no one could have anticipated, least of all her. While Brennan was focused on the mission, his personal life was beginning to crumble beneath him. His increasingly erratic choices, particularly involving Josslyn, would set into motion a chain of events that would make Carly question her role in his life and the true nature of his loyalty. The trust between them, once unshakable, began to falter. Brennan's decision to send Josslyn into an escalating situation, despite the obvious risks, revealed his darker motivations, a side of him Carly hadn't seen before. The lines between loyalty, power, and affection blurred, creating a volatile mix that would have catastrophic consequences. As Josslyn and Vaughn arrived in Dalmatia, the landscape that once seemed peaceful quickly turned into a battlefield. Initially, it was meant to be a straightforward job: gather intelligence and return to base. But the moment they set foot in the 5 Poppies resort, things took an unexpected turn. The mission, which should have been relatively simple, grew more perilous by the minute. In the heart of Dalmatia, the stakes of their assignment skyrocketed, revealing a complex web of danger and deception. What was initially thought to be a mere assignment for the WSB quickly turned into a fight for survival. Their mission was far from just reconnaissance. Soon, Josslyn and Vaughn found themselves plunged into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with enemies lurking around every corner. They were no longer just operatives following orders, they had become unwilling pawns in a much larger, more deadly scheme. Despite the looming danger, Josslyn found herself oddly drawn to Vaughn, whose calm demeanor and quiet strength offered her a semblance of security in an otherwise chaotic world. The two of them, thrown together by circumstances, began to forge a bond. What started as a simple cover story, pretending to be newlyweds, gradually morphed into something more real. As they shared their fears, their pasts, and their most intimate thoughts, the lines between the mission and their growing connection began to blur. Josslyn had been no stranger to loss. She had already suffered the tragic deaths of Oscar and Dex, each one leaving an indelible mark on her heart. The pain of their departures still haunted her, and the prospect of losing someone else was a fear she couldn't shake. Vaughn, though a relatively new figure in her life, was quickly becoming a source of strength for her. She had never imagined that she would find someone she could lean on so deeply, someone who understood the weight of the life she had chosen, yet still offered her a sense of solace in the chaos. But as the mission grew more dangerous and the threats more imminent, Josslyn began to realize that Vaughn might not be able to protect her forever. The life she led, one filled with danger and uncertainty, seemed destined to claim yet another victim. As they navigated the treacherous landscape of Dalmatia, their mission began to unravel in ways they couldn't have anticipated. They were no longer just two agents on a mission, they were survivors, trying desperately to stay one step ahead of forces far beyond their control. The resort, once an idyllic retreat, now felt like a prison, each day bringing them closer to danger and further from the life they had known. Josslyn's growing attachment to Vaughn, though comforting, only served to heighten her fears. The more she cared for him, the more she feared for his safety. It was a cruel irony. She had already lost two people she loved, and now, Vaughn was at risk of becoming another casualty in her already painful life. But the deeper they got into the mission, the more Josslyn began to question Brennan's true intentions. Why had he sent her into this mess in the first place? Why had he failed to prepare her for the dangers she was about to face? Was this mission truly just about reconnaissance, or was it part of a much larger, more dangerous game that Brennan had been playing all along? As Josslyn delved deeper into the mystery, she found herself trapped in a web of lies, secrets, and betrayal. One that she might not be able to escape from. And as she and Vaughn grew closer, the danger to them both became all the more real. The fate of Josslyn and Vaughn now seemed uncertain. Would they make it out of Dalmatia alive? Or would they be the next victims in a never-ending game of survival? As the mission reached its climax, Josslyn found herself facing the hardest decision of her life. Would she be able to survive the treacherous world she had found herself in, or would she lose everything, including the only person she had come to trust in this nightmare? Life within the WSB had always been complicated and dangerous, but for Josslyn and Vaughn, the true gravity of the situation would become clear only after they arrived in Dalmatia. Brennan, a man with immense power within the WSB, had placed an insidious trust in his agents, knowing full well the stakes of their mission. At the outset, he had assured Carly, his lover, that the operation would be simple, that Josslyn and Vaughn would be in and out without incident. It was supposed to be an easy reconnaissance mission, an assignment that would strengthen his hold on the WSB, but it was clear that Brennan had miscalculated. What began as a straightforward mission spiraled into something much darker, something no one had anticipated. The serene Five Poppies Resort, which they were supposed to use as a backdrop for their operation, turned out to be a front for something far more sinister. The dangers that Josslyn and Vaughn would face there had not been accounted for, and suddenly, the stakes were much higher than either of them could imagine. The mission, which had seemed so trivial from the WSB's perspective, had evolved into a deadly game of survival. Brennan, who had been so confident in his ability to control the mission and the outcomes, seemed to lose control of the situation entirely. As his own life came under threat from forces within the WSB, he found himself entangled in a web of political maneuvering and power struggles that left him unable to focus on the well-being of his agents. For the first time, Brennan's own safety and ambitions began to take precedence over the lives of those he had assigned to the mission. This sudden shift in focus left Josslyn and Vaughn vulnerable, and the choices Brennan made in the heat of the moment would ultimately leave them exposed. Carly, Brennan's lover, had been deeply unaware of the true depths of his manipulation. She had trusted him, believing that their connection was solid enough to withstand the dangers of their lives in the WSB. But as Brennan's decisions began to unravel, it became clear that their relationship, built on secrets and lies, was about to face its most challenging test. As Brennan's priorities shifted, Carly found herself questioning the foundation of their bond. She had thought that love could shield them from the chaos of their dangerous lives, but Brennan's increasing betrayals showed her that, in their world, love was a fleeting, fragile thing. Josslyn, on the other hand, was quickly realizing that the life she had chosen had forced her into a corner. She had already lost too much, Oscar, Dex. And now she was being dragged deeper into a world that had no regard for the fragile emotions of its participants. What had started as a mission to collect intelligence in Dalmatia had escalated into a life-or-death struggle, and Josslyn found herself fighting for her survival in a way she had never anticipated. The reality of the WSB's dangers became starkly clear, and Josslyn's fears for her own life grew with each passing day. Her connection to Vaughn, though initially professional, began to deepen as the danger increased. At first, their bond had been something of a necessity, a professional alliance forged in the heat of the mission. They had relied on each other for survival, both outwardly focused on the task at hand, but the longer they were together, the more personal their connection became. Vaughn, though still a relative stranger to Josslyn, had become her anchor in the chaos around them. Their growing emotional attachment was something Josslyn hadn't expected, but it was undeniable. They had come to depend on one another, and in the face of overwhelming odds, this bond became their only source of strength. The emotional stakes for Josslyn were now much higher than she had anticipated. She had already suffered the loss of two men she had loved, and she feared that Vaughn would be the next casualty in the brutal world she inhabited. Losing Vaughn, however, would not just be the loss of a fellow agent, it would be the loss of someone she had come to care for deeply, someone who had become a vital part of her emotional survival. The thought of him becoming another name on the list of those she had lost was unbearable, and as the mission became more perilous, Josslyn's fears for Vaughn's safety grew. The mission itself was spiraling out of control. What had seemed like a simple intelligence-gathering operation had turned into a full-blown crisis. Vaughn and Josslyn were now at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. The WSB's manipulation of its agents, the hidden agendas, and the brutal political games they played had all come to the surface. As the walls closed in around them, Josslyn began to realize that survival wasn't guaranteed. She had learned that lesson the hard way with Oscar and Dex, and now she feared that Vaughn would be the next to fall. Despite her growing feelings for Vaughn, Josslyn knew that the cost of survival in the WSB was far too high. Their emotional connection was real, but it was also dangerous. The deeper they became involved with one another, the more vulnerable they became to the forces that sought to destroy them. Josslyn couldn't afford to allow herself to feel too deeply. Love was a weakness in this world, and her attachment to Vaughn could very well lead to his demise. But even as she tried to distance herself emotionally, she found herself unable to stop caring. Vaughn had become too important to her, and she couldn't just walk away. As the mission progressed, the tension between them only grew. Vaughn's chances of survival were growing slimmer by the day. The enemies they faced were more powerful, more ruthless, and they had no qualms about using Josslyn and Vaughn as pawns in their deadly game. Josslyn, once confident in her ability to handle any situation, now found herself questioning whether she could survive this particular battle. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before, and the consequences of failure were too devastating to contemplate. The darkness of this world was closing in around Josslyn. Every choice she made seemed to bring her closer to the edge of destruction. The emotional toll was beginning to weigh heavily on her. Could she continue to fight for her survival, knowing that each step she took might lead to the death of another person she cared about? Could she keep her heart locked away from the danger that surrounded her, or would she be forced to confront the reality of the WSB's cruel existence? If Vaughn did not survive this mission, Josslyn would face the greatest loss of all, the loss of the last person who had made her believe in the possibility of connection in a world filled with deception and death. The story of Josslyn's survival in the WSB had never been a simple one. From the moment she joined, she had been forced to confront the darkest aspects of humanity, to sacrifice parts of herself in order to survive. But as the mission in Dalmatia reached its breaking point, she realized that the cost of survival might be more than she could bear. If Vaughn died, it would be a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she was still fighting to protect. But in the cruel, unforgiving world of the WSB, survival meant nothing if you couldn't survive emotionally. And Josslyn, in the face of the greatest threat of her life, would have to decide whether she could endure yet another loss, or whether this mission would be the one that would break her entirely. The relationship between Josslyn and Vaughn, though fragile and born out of necessity, had grown into something much deeper over the course of their mission. What began as a simple professional alliance had shifted into something far more personal, as their time spent together in the dangerous world of the WSB slowly wove a bond between them. Yet, the very nature of their connection, formed in the heat of chaos, also made it vulnerable. This love, fragile and uncertain, became the driving force behind Josslyn's inner conflict as she found herself trapped in a situation where survival was never guaranteed. From the moment they were thrust into the perilous world of espionage and danger, Josslyn had been forced to suppress her emotions in order to remain focused. But the longer she spent with Vaughn, the harder it became to push those feelings away. He had become more than just an ally in her eyes. In a world that constantly demanded sacrifice, Vaughn was the one piece of her humanity she hadn't been willing to let go of. But now, as their mission spiraled out of control, that very connection was threatening to pull them both deeper into a deadly trap. The web of deception that Brennan had woven around them was slowly closing in. Josslyn had been unaware of just how far Brennan would go to manipulate those around him to achieve his own ends. His betrayal was more than just the assignment he had given her, it was the entire structure of lies and power games that had been at play behind the scenes. Josslyn was caught in the middle of it all, unaware that her emotions were being used against her, making her even more vulnerable to the very fate Brennan had designed for her and Vaughn. As Josslyn faced the terrifying possibility that Vaughn might not make it out of Dalmatia alive, the weight of past losses began to bear down on her. She had already lost so much: Oscar, the love of her life, who had been ripped away by a cruel illness, and Dex, whose tragic end had left her heartbroken. Every time she allowed herself to care for someone, it seemed the universe took them away. Now, standing on the precipice of losing Vaughn as well, Josslyn couldn't help but feel as though she was trapped in a cycle of death and heartbreak that she could never escape. Her fear wasn't just for herself, it was for Vaughn. Despite their relatively short time together, the bond they had formed was undeniable. They had leaned on each other through the worst of times, and Vaughn had proven himself to be a steadfast companion in the face of unimaginable danger. The idea of him becoming just another name on the list of people she had lost was something Josslyn couldn't fathom. Yet, the deeper they were pulled into the mission's chaos, the more she realized that nothing in this world, especially not love, was truly safe. The mission had taken a dangerous turn, and everything Josslyn had once taken for granted now felt like a fragile illusion. Brennan's true intentions were beginning to surface, revealing a man who had used his power and influence for his own gain, without regard for the lives he destroyed along the way. His manipulation of Josslyn and Vaughn was not just a matter of professional betrayal, it was a personal betrayal of trust. In the end, it was clear that Brennan had never cared about the safety of those he sent on these deadly missions, they were just expendable pieces in a larger game. Now, as Vaughn's life hung in the balance, Josslyn faced a horrifying truth. She might lose him in the same way she had lost so many others. The mission's deadly nature had become painfully clear, and with it, the reality that Vaughn might not survive to see another day. He had already sacrificed so much in their shared pursuit of survival, and now he stood on the brink of losing everything. If he died, it wouldn't just be a tragic end to a mission, it would be the end of something far more meaningful. For Josslyn, losing Vaughn would be a brutal reminder of the high price of living in a world like theirs, where every decision could lead to death, and every connection was doomed to be torn apart. But what terrified her the most wasn't just the prospect of losing him, it was the knowledge that her own emotional attachment had made her vulnerable to the dangers around them. Love, in this brutal world, was a weakness. And the more Josslyn cared for Vaughn, the more she felt she was sealing their fates. Could she protect him from the unseen dangers lurking at every turn? Could she keep him safe, or would she watch him slip away, just as she had watched so many others perish before him? The real question was whether she could live with the consequences of their love if it led to Vaughn's death. Would she be able to carry the burden of his loss, knowing that it was her connection to him that had led him into this trap? And, if he died, could she continue to live in this world that had stripped her of everything she held dear, or would she, too, be consumed by the darkness that seemed to follow her wherever she went? Josslyn had always been a fighter, but the emotional toll of this mission was beginning to break her. Every decision she made seemed to bring her closer to the edge. The fear of loss, of seeing Vaughn's life extinguished before her eyes, was almost too much to bear. The possibility of his death felt inevitable, like an inescapable fate that had been sealed the moment they were sent to Dalmatia. But she couldn't just give up. She couldn't allow herself to surrender to the idea that she was doomed to live in this world of heartbreak and death forever. If Vaughn died, it wouldn't just be the end of a mission. It would be the death of a future that Josslyn had begun to imagine for herself, a future that didn't involve constant loss, fear, and heartache. The reality of that loss was something she couldn't face. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like an inevitable outcome in this dangerous world of espionage and betrayal. Josslyn had spent her life running from pain, from loss, from the ghosts of her past, but now, she realized that running wasn't enough. This mission, this love, this world, had all led her to a place where she could no longer escape.